Welcome back to Myths and Mayhem. Last time we talked about the Minotaur, a monster trapped in a maze, and monster created by a god's grudge, a king's bad decision, and an inventor who really should have started asking follow-up questions. But before there was a hero standing in front of the Minotaur, there had to be a hero. And that's where Theseus comes in. Now, most heroes in Greek mythology have unusual childhoods. Some are raised by wolves, some are hidden from monsters, and some discover they're secretly children of gods. Theseus looked at all of these stories and said, why not all of the above? Well, not exactly, but close enough. Our story begins with King A.G.H.S of Athens. Actually, that's not entirely true. Our story begins with a king who had a problem. A.G.H.S had wealth, he had power, he had a kingdom. What he didn't have was an heir. And if you've listened long enough to mythology, you know that's where troubles normally start. Because eventually somebody visits an oracle. And sure enough, A.G.H.S visits an oracle. The oracle gives him a prophecy. Naturally, the prophecy is confusing. That's also naturally. At this point, I'm convinced that the Oracle of Delphi gets paid extra every time she makes a prophecy harder to understand. Now, A.G.H.S leaves exactly with the same number of questions he arrived with, which is impressive. Eventually, he arrives in the city of Trozen, where he meets the king Periphetes. Now, Periphetes hears the prophecy and thinks he understands it. Whether he actually does is another question entirely, but that's never stopped anyone in Greek mythology before. One thing leads to another, and 9 months later, Theseus is born. Now here's where things get interesting. Depending on which version of the story you're reading, Theseus either has one father or two. Some stories say that his father is A.G.H.S, while other stories say Poseidon, which means that Theseus begins life with a problem we've encountered before. Whenever Poseidon appears in a family tree, things tend to get complicated. If you listen to our Minotaur episode, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Poseidon remains undefeated in the category of making things weird. Eventually, A.G.H.S prepares to leave. Before he goes, he places a sword and a pair of sandals beneath a giant rock. Not a normal rock, a massive, giant rock. The kind of rock that makes people look at it and immediately decide somebody else should move that thing. A.G.H.S tells Theseus' mother, when the boy is old enough to lift this rock, send him to Athens. Then he leaves. And that's the setup. A sword, a pair of sandals, a giant rock, and a kid who doesn't know his entire life is sitting underneath it. Years pass. Theseus grows up. Now imagine being Theseus. Every day you walk past this giant rock. Nobody explains it, nobody talks about it, and everyone gets weird every time you ask questions about it. That's suspicious. At some point, every kid starts wondering what's under the rock. Theseus probably started wondering about that around age 6. By age 10, he was probably poking it with sticks. By age 15, he was probably convinced that there was some treasure underneath it. Turns out the truth is somewhat stranger. Eventually, his mother decides it's time. She tells him about A.G.H.S. She tells him about the sword, the sandals, the kingdom, and possibly that his father may either be a king or Poseidon. Again, complicated. Then she points at the rock. Now here's the thing. Most people would hear the story and think, it's a lot to process. Theseus hears the story and immediately walks over to the rock because he's already Theseus. He lifts up the rock and the sword appears, the sandals appear, and suddenly everything changes. Yesterday, he was a teenager in Trozen. Today, he's the main character. And now, if you've never met somebody who suddenly discovers they're destined for greatness, count yourself lucky, because they become exhausting almost immediately. And Theseus has just learned he has a destiny. Now Athens is waiting. There's only one problem. It's on the other side of Greece. Fortunately, there are 2 ways to get there. The first route is by sea. It's safe, efficient, reasonable. A route chosen by people who enjoy remaining alive. The second route is overland, and by overland I mean bandits, murderers, monsters, criminals, and enough danger to keep therapists employed for generations. Everyone tells Theseus to take the sea route. It's safer, His mom suggests it. His grandfather suggests it. Random strangers probably suggest it. The sea route is obviously the better option. Theseus chooses the dangerous route immediately. Longtime listeners are probably recognizing the symptoms already. I'm not going to go into A.G.H.S again. Suffice it to say, it's ancient Greek hero syndrome. If you would prefer a refresher, go listen to the Perseus episode or our last episode with the Minotaur. The point is, Theseus hears dangerous and somehow translates that into this is going to be fun. And so he begins walking toward Athens, toward his destiny, toward every criminal who is about to have a very bad day. Now his first obstacle is Periphetes. Now Periphetes carried a giant bronze club. That's basically his entire personality. Imagine being so committed to a weapon that future generations describe you as the club guy. Ancient Greece could be brutal. Periphetes terrorized travelers. He robbed them, beat them, and generally made himself everyone's problem. Then he met Theseus. And unfortunately for Periphetes, Theseus was looking for trouble, and trouble had finally shown up. The fight wasn't much of a fight. Theseus wins, Periphetes loses, and the club ownership changes, and Theseus keeps walking. Now here's something important. This isn't just a fight scene. This is the beginning of a pattern, because Theseus isn't defeating criminals. He's defeating them using their own methods, and that's the part that makes his legend spread. The stories aren't a hero defeated a bandit. The stories are a hero showed a bandit exactly what his victims have been dealing with, and people remember stories like that, especially criminals who are starting to get nervous. The next person he comes across is Sinis. Now, Sinis had a nickname, Pinebender. This is not to be confused with Aang in being an airbender. This is Pinebender. And if you're thinking that sounds suspicious, you're right. Sinis had discovered what happens when you combine trees, rope, and deeply questionable life choices. Travelers would arrive, Sinis would capture them, and things would go down here from there very quickly. Now here's where we see Theseus' pattern start developing. A lot of heroes defeat monsters. A lot of heroes defeat villains. Theseus specializes in giving bad people exactly what they've been handing out, which is one of those things that sounds satisfying until you realize it probably means that you're standing very close to a dangerous person. Sinis tries his usual routine. Theseus responds with his own, and suddenly Greece has one less roadside problem. Now here's the lesson buried inside of all of this. Most bullies think that they're strong because nobody has stopped them. Most tyrants think that they're powerful because nobody's challenged them. Then one day somebody stands up who isn't afraid. The entire illusion falls apart. Sinis spent years terrifying travelers when he met one traveler who wasn't impressed. And it turns out that changes everything. Now, some versions of the story include another challenge, the Crommyonian Sow, a giant wild pig, because apparently Greek mythology occasionally pauses and says, you know what this story needs? A boss fight. Now, this creature had been terrorizing the countryside, destroying crops, attacking farms, making life miserable for everyone nearby. So naturally, Theseus decides to hunt it. At this point, he's basically checking side points off a list. He defeats the creature. The countryside celebrates, and Theseus continues along his way. Now, most people would hear this story and think, maybe I've done enough heroics for one road trip. Not Theseus. He's just getting warmed up. Eventually, Theseus encounters Sciron. Now, Sciron lived near a cliff overlooking the sea, which sounds beautiful because it probably was. Unfortunately, Sciron ruined it. Travelers would arrive, and Sciron would demand that they wash his feet, which is already a strange way of beginning a conversation. Then, while they're distracted, he kicks them off the cliff. Now, I know we've talked about some very strange villains. We've discussed Medusa, the Minotaur, the Gree sharing one eyeball, but demanding foot washing before attempted murder is still amongst the weirdest at the top of the list. And it's also really gross. And somehow it gets weirder because the bottom of the cliff is a giant turtle. Not a normal turtle, a giant man-eating turtle. The kind of turtle that makes you look at regular turtles and think, you know what, maybe we're fine with the normal size one. Sciron would kick his victims off the cliff, and the turtle would handle the rest, which raises a lot of questions, most of them beginning with why. Unfortunately, Greek mythology rarely answers those questions. Sciron tries his routine with Theseus, and it goes exactly as you would expect. Theseus grabs Sciron, drags him toward the edge, and suddenly Sciron finds himself participating in his own demonstration. The giant turtle gets a different meal that day, and Theseus keeps moving on. At this point, word is spreading. Every outlaw between Trozen and Athens are hearing the same rumors. A young man is coming. He's carrying a bronze club, and wherever he goes, local crime statistics improve dramatically. Enter Procrustes. Now, Procrustes may have been the worst innkeeper in human history, which is impressive. Hospitality is literally his profession. Now, Procrustes owned a bed. Actually, he owned several beds, and he was obsessed with making travelers fit them. If somebody was too short, he would stretch them. If somebody was too tall, he would shorten them. And suddenly, every bad hotel review that you've ever read somehow seems much less severe. Imagine checking into a hotel and discovering that the owner is conducting furniture-based experiments. No thank you. Now, by this point, every criminal in Greece should have learned something. The stories are everywhere. Theseus is coming. He's undefeated. He's carrying a giant bronze club. And he's solving problems aggressively. But apparently, criminals in mythology suffer from the same condition that villains in action movies do. Every single one hears the stories and thinks, nah, I can win. I got this. They don't got this. And honestly, by this point, the whole thing starts feeling a little like John Wick. Not because someone hurt Theseus' dog, but because every bad guy keeps hearing the warning, and every bad guy keeps ignoring the warning, and every bad guy immediately regrets the decision not to hearken to the warning. Procrustes becomes the latest example, and Athens gets one step closer. Eventually, Theseus arrives. Now, after everything he's survived, you'd think that things were going to calm down. They don't, because Athens already has enough drama without adding heroes to the mix. King A.G.H.S is older. Years have passed. The boy with the stuff beneath the rock is gone, and standing before A.G.H.S is a grown man, carrying a sword and a reputation. A.G.H.S doesn't immediately recognize him. Medea, she does. And that's the problem. If you've listened to mythology for any amount of time, you'll know that Medea doesn't usually appear in stories because they're going well. She sees Theseus, and she sees the threat, and she starts planning. Now, Medea understands something immediately. If this stranger is A.G.H.S son, everything changes. The future changes. The succession changes. Her influence changes. And Medea isn't interested in any of those changes. So she convinces A.G.H.S that this newcomer is dangerous. And she's not entirely wrong. Theseus has spent several weeks solving problems with the club. The man arrives with the energy of a natural disaster. A feast is arranged, a cup is prepared, and poison is added, because mythology continues proving that conflict resolution was not a priority in ancient Greece. Everything is ready. The cup is handed to Theseus, and then Theseus draws his sword, not to fight, not to threaten, just to cut his food. A.G.H.S sees the blade, the sword beneath the rock, the sword he left years ago, and suddenly everything clicks. The stranger isn't an enemy, he is his son. The cup goes flying. Medea's plan is over, and shortly afterwards, she leaves Athens, which for everyone involved is probably for the best. And just like that, Theseus finds his father, finds his place, and discovers he has another problem to deal with. Now, while all of this has been happening, Athens has been living under a shadow shaped suspiciously like a giant bull. Every few years, 14 young Athenians are sent to Crete. 7 boys, 7 girls. The tribute. Everyone knows what's going on. The Labyrinth. Everybody knows what's waiting there. The Minotaur. And nobody comes back. Imagine growing up hearing these stories. Imagine knowing your name could be chosen. Imagine watching ships leave full of kids and return empty. Athens wasn't just afraid of the Minotaur. Athens was exhausted by it. And eventually, Theseus hears the story, the tribute, the maze, the monster. Now a normal person hears this story and thinks, that's terrible. A normal person hears this story and thinks somebody should do something. Theseus hears that story and thinks, I'm somebody. Immediately, no hesitation, no strategy meeting, no committee, no discussion, just, I'll go. The king hates the idea. The city hates the idea. Reasonable people hate the idea. Theseus volunteers anyway. Because if there's one thing that we've learned about heroes, it's this. They don't usually run toward danger because they're fearless. They run toward danger because they believe somebody has to. And sooner or later, they start believing that that someone always has to be them. It's classic A.G.H.S in action right here. So Theseus joins the tribute. He boards the ship and sails toward Crete, toward the Labyrinth, toward the Minotaur, toward the story that everyone remembers. In conclusion, when somebody tells you there's a giant man-eating monster inside of an impossible maze, most people think, I need to stay away. Theseus thought, I got this. Classic A.G.H.S. We'll see how that works out for him next time. See you soon. And if you're enjoying Myths and Mayhem, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes.